Hello there, everybody. Sorry about the my tardiness. It was all my fault. I actually was running around doing errands, and it took me a lot longer than expected to find the items I need. I'm going to be having a family gathering soon at my house, but that's besides the point. In any case, I'm happy to have back on narmyl-hoctyl to talk about Marxism. Narmal?
Yeah, for sure. I was on last time talking about generative anthropology. Um, that's up, and yeah, I have some some thoughts about Marxism. I think that are pretty common in our circles, but that are not, well exposed to the greater, to the discourse at large. So glad to be on the channel again. Glad to be talking again.
Ah, I see, I see. So, I heard that you have a video planned about Marxism. You already have made a couple of videos on Marx
Right.
before. One where you pit Marx against Giorgiani, and another where you sort of debunk the kind of dialectical materialism in your response to Bausch.
Right, yeah, and it's funny. I think in one of those I said that it would be my last video on Marxism. Too bad that is not how it's going. I mean, there's a lot there. It's pretty convincing to smart people in a lot of ways. Is the thing about Marxism. It's not like a lot of the more normie political theory, because there was like a good solid decade where Marxism was the normie political theory among smart people. And part of a lot of the larger normie economic systems don't even enter into our discourse. So anyway, part of the convincing things about Marxism are valid and also exist in like a lot of the economic systems that are more common in our circles. But there's a couple principles there that are kind of pernicious and lead, I mean, pretty inevitably to liberalism, a la Chris Bond or someone, not in the sense that Marx would be using the term, but yeah, covering those important Schelling points is more what I want to do at the worldview level, because I mean, my last video was about worldviews and paradigms, and this one is supposed to be about um, how those apply or how to analyze those. Marxism is just a good example to use that for.
All right. Yeah, it's sort of a backdrop then. So
Right.
when you talk, when I think of Marxism, I usually think of the kinds of people on the internet who, uh, essentially, what they try to do is they try to make everything about this boogeyman called capitalism and what exactly and they all claim that capitalism is something like where when profit is the dominating force in society or when or either that or the general Marxist term, when the means of production are in the hands of the capitalist class.
Right.
uh, but the it but the thing is when it comes to Marxists, they seem to uh, attribute almost omnipotent powers to capitalism. If you listen to a particular leftist or a Marxist, the same, there's a lot of overlap there. If you look at any particular Marxist-inspired thinker, you'll be surprised at how much they can say, "Oh, this is caused by capitalism." Oh, the fact that there are family
Yeah,
values,
right.
that's caused by capitalism. Christianity caused by capitalism. And so on and so forth. It seems like almost everything that the Marxist doesn't like is somehow a product of capitalism.
Right. That's I mean this leads pretty nicely into the fact that there's um a yawning gap. There's a great difference between what Karl Marx, this particular guy, wrote and thought, and what the people who call themselves Marxists think. There's a lot of, I guess the genre is midrash, if you know anything about Jewish theology. There's this whole genre of literature in that field, midrash, of the narrative and the stories and the events of the Bible and of Scripture and of other maybe more particular Jewish mythology. Um, or other stuff that is particularly Jewish mythology, I should say. Um, that there are commentaries written on that don't that sort of make a half-hearted attempt at being true to the original. I guess maybe the closest Christian comparison would be a Hexameron. The reason I mention that is because a lot of the literature around Marxism, the transdiscipline that continued after Marx had died and went through Friedrich Engels' interpretations and such, that deposit is something much larger and more particular, and uh, there's definitely a lot of people that believe less true to Marx, um, including lots of the neo-Marxists, than what would be ideal for something called Marxism. And a lot of the stuff you're referring to, it's present in Marx, and this specific thing probably does have like a basis in what you'd find in Capital or the contribution to the critique of political economy. Not the critique itself, the contribution. So where would I trace that in actual Marxist thought? Well, they sort of see history in a lot of the way St. David, or Spengler does, as successive uh, paradigms or dominant zeitgeists. And for them, at the point of Marx, there's not a definite procession from, say, or before feudalism, some manifold versions of primitive accumulation, they call it, into feudalism and then capitalism, and then various stages that culminate in communism. That is not so fleshed out in Marx, but there is the idea of us presently being in capitalism, and there is a telos of history, which is communism. And the place where, or the part of the theory, the significant part of the theory that allows them to say that so-and-so economic system is the like moral agent behind these events, is because they kind of well, he says it explicitly in the preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy. He says basically directly, I mean, I have the quote somewhere here, but paraphrasing, that our social, our religious, legal existence, everything that's cultural or properly human, what Heidegger might call technological in a broad sense of the word, that is all itself not fundamental, but derivative of a more fundamental system, which is the definite relations of production. He uses a kind of more fleshed out phrase, but because of that, because for him there's a direct emergent one-to-one, or not one-to-one, but apples to apples procession from the fundamental to him material productive economic forms, from that to the social, even for them ethical at one point in the future, legal, political structure of society. Eventually, for people who are a little bit better versed in, or know a little bit more about Marxist thought, this clearly sounds a lot like what gets called the base and superstructure relationship. That appears nowhere in Marx's writings, but it does get fleshed out in Anti-Dühring and other bits by Engels. The part of that is based in Marx is the idea that you have a base in the proper sense of the word, the actual fundamental material productive faculties and interactions. So like the value form is counted under there, which we can get into. And then epiphenomenally emerging out of that, you have the social superstructure. The part that is, of course, not in Marx is that the superstructure in any way affects the base, which was surreptitiously added on by not just Engels. In fact, I don't think Engels outright says that anywhere, but I'm not really well read with Engels. Later Marxist authors insert that in because to have a coherent, sensible theory that stands up to the data when it comes to paleoanthropology and archaeology, you're not going to be able to make it if you believe that the raw material productive faculties are the root of, and not just the causal root, but the root in terms of primacy, right, for all of the social forms of existence. So that was a lot. I mean, there's more that I could get into there, but I'm gonna let that bounce off you.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot that I can go into with Marx, things that I like in Marxism, things that I do not like in Marxism. Um, so one of the ideas that I've come across when looking at Marxist theory is the sort of some of the this kind of dichotomy between the young Marx and the old Marx.
Right.
So the idea is that when you look at works young the works of young Marx, something like when in something like say his critique of Feuerbach, for example, that's more metaphysical, whereas it's where Marx is still it's finding himself still breaking away from Hegelianism. And then once you reach his later works like Capital, that's where Marx has this epistemic break, as Louis Althusser argues, where moves from being a metaphysician into a more of a more of a real economist and an anthropologist.
Right.
And so Althus now Marxists, a lot of different Marxists will have different views on this. If you're more of like a modern neo-Marxist type, then young Marx is going to be more appealing because that's where Marx is more focused on alienation, on how these oppressive social structures are causing us to have these bad feelings. Whereas mature Marx is going to appeal more to the people who are kind of what we would call orthodox Marxists, the kinds of people who who like Marx because of his kinds of things he said in works like Capital.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, and
so would you agree with something like that, or do you think that this young Marx, old Marx split is kind of arbitrary?
yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, if you talk in especially online spheres about Marxism, you'll find a lot of people that take issue with that. But that's a small obsessed subset of people. Even most Marxists would agree with that sort of typology. In terms of dates, yeah, he moves to England in I think 1845, and that's around the period where you start to see the really intense shift, kind of like a German and the English Marx almost. So, I mean, it follows from that the 1844 manuscripts are mostly content from a young Marxist perspective. Anyway, this is part of where like there's kind of accolades due for Marxism because it's not. I mean, it's a theory that's serious enough for it to be inappropriate to evaluate it in terms of like the theory is bad or the theory is good, because there's good elements to it, and the instinct that a lot of people have, like what I just said, is very like kindergarten teacher platitudesy, but a lot of people have the instinct to, hear the word Marxism and think like, I don't know, Ibram X. Kendi, and kind of immediately react, rejecting
one way.
the premises.
Yeah, rejecting, or in some cases they just dive right in wholeheartedly without being critical.
Yeah. I mean, that's another issue that causes a lot of cross pollination in Marxist circles, especially with like not that well educated people, which is most of them. or not well read is the term I'd rather use. And yeah,
Yeah, I
causes
mean,
issues.
that's what I mean, to be fair, there are a lot of, I think I once got into well, not I didn't wasn't participating, but watched this live stream talk between my friend Todd Lewis and a couple of old lefty guys, Keith Preston and Derek Jensen. Derek Jensen being the guy behind. Do you remember that queer anarchism Jeopardy video on YouTube?
No.
Okay, well if you don't know what that is, look up queer Jeopardy on YouTube sometime. Derek Jensen, man, he is pretty good. But he is like totally dyed in the wool, old fashioned lefty environmentalist and narco
Nice.
primitivist. And so anyway, in any case, uh, so Derek Jensen and Keith Preston are talking to Todd Lewis about the younger leftists, and what they find is that in their experience, the younger leftists tend not to even understand Marx, and if they do talk about him, it's on a very superficial level.
Yeah. True.
They have these kinds of broad strokes views of Marxism that lead them to having all kinds of things, and they get very mad, and yet they get very mad if you criticize Marx in any way, even if it's, I mean, even, yeah, there's a lot of bad criticism of Marx, but there's a lot of good
Right.
criticism of Marx that causes them to, and especially of Marxists, that causes them to get really mad. For example, there was this one guy named Jonas. He runs this YouTube channel, Cuck Philosophy, and he got
Yeah. That's
and and he got really butthurt at Dave the Distributist, because Distributist pointed out that Marxists had totally different definitions of capitalism, and some
Mhm.
Marxists, and he says that true Marxism isn't egalitarian. That's what Cuck Philosophy says. True Marxism isn't egalitarian, because Marx actually rejects egalitarianism explicitly in this paper, and Distributist actually says, well, yeah, Marx says that, but there are a bunch of idiot Marxists out there who are very pro-egalitarian, including Richard Wolff, for example.
Yeah.
He is totally, like most modern Marxists would consider themselves egalitarians,
Yeah.
and
I don't.
then
The thing with that is that like they're kind of correct in the sense of I'm going to be kind of quick with this because I want you to continue, but they're correct in that like the difference that a really good programmer makes in wage and a very poor one makes would not go away under communism, but not under Marx's projection or Engels. But the kind of, I mean, the way that they read inequality is mostly structural, even though, or even in the places where it's evidently not, but emerging from structures that they think would go away. Like when we say egalitarianism, when the tribute says egalitarianism, he doesn't mean that two workers that are generally in the same stratum of job and class are going to get paid the same amount. The diversity of what I mean by that is labor put into their work. That's the idea in Marxism. Is that if you're or Marxism in communism, you're paid commensurately for your labor. So of course that inequality would still remain, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the things that they erroneously attribute to structures that, again, erroneously they attribute to um, origin in capitalism, to capitalism as their ideology.
Hmm. Right. Now there are now. There are all kinds of things I'd like to about Marxism that I'd like
Mm-hmm.
to tackle. but I'd like to first talk a little bit about what we've talked about in DMs, which is um, which is Marxist epiphenomenalism.
Mm,
Which is what we in both the young. This is something that's both in the young Marx in his ideas of alienation, and also in the older Marx when he talks about the how the revolution is going to emerge as this kind of teleological
right.
factor. So in the young Marx, he in the young so a little bit of backstory on Marx and how he came up with his ideology. So so Hegel, when we talk about when we talk about Hegel, when we talk in Hegel, it was part of this movement uh, uh, of these kinds of people and kinds of people who found the Enlightenment's kind of dull bourgeois rationalism uh, kind of oppressive. You know, we have to, in throwing out off the shackles of religions, the Romantics argue, post Enlightenment man had signed himself up to the slave ship of dreary rationality. And so, and as a result, mankind was alienated by liberalism. And so Hegel comes along and he says, well, liberalism, and so alienation is kind of this medico-psychiatric idea. The idea is that the self judge the self is too judgmental of the self, and because the self is because you have such a harsh self judgment, it creates this alienation. And Hegel takes the alienated consciousness to task by saying this self judgment rests on a contradiction. If this consciousness is judging itself, this is equivalent to a judge judging his own judgment, and this creates an infinite regress. And so the way you overcome this alienation is through kind of therapy and people and pointing out to people, hey, you're judging yourself too harshly. Now, the thing is, Hegel actually states explicitly in his work that if you that you can't project this alienation onto the external world, because that would be a cop out, because you would be blaming society for your own personal problems. And this kind of and that's sort of Hegel's liberal Protestantism coming out, I think. You actually see a bit of that in certain modern day conservatives like Jordan Peterson. You know, the idea that, oh, there's you got to clean your room, bucko, if you want to. That's basically Hegel. um and and so Hegel says um if you try to project this the cause of this damaged psyche onto the external reality, then you will create societal disorder, and you'll create basically a witch mob and a conspiracy, and that will act on this idea conspiracy theory that fanatical priests are oppressing them. And
Yep.
and of course that's exactly what Feuerbach, one of Hegel's followers, did with his theory, where he basic so basically what Feuerbach says is that it's religion that is the cause of our alienation, because God, it's not our own consciousness that's judging us, but our idea of God that was instilled into us by.
Oh, you just drop on the stream too. Uh-oh. Okay, I am somehow still on stream, and he must accidentally hit the button to leave.
Hey, can you hear me?
All right, there we can hear.
I don't know what happened. It just cut out. on my
Yeah, but
internet
either I
for
checked the stream and was like,
yeah.
uh-oh. And then it was
Where
still
did
live.
I
And
did
was
I
like,
did
okay.
I cut out? Did I cut out? When did I cut out?
I mean, you cut out kind of like in the middle of a sentence. You were talking about
Yeah,
what is it? He
Feuerbach.
accounts it to religion,
Yeah,
the alienation.
yeah. Feuerbach says that it's religion that is causing our alienation, and that whereas Hegel says that it's our own inner voice that is judging us too harshly, that is the source of our alienation. Feuerbach says, well, actually, that inner voice is the voice of God, and God is the self-conscious, is our idea of God is put into us by evil priests. To be, this is what he actually says in his book. He says, in the essence of Christianity, the consciousness of God is the self-consciousness of man. The knowledge of God is the self-knowledge of man. Man's notion of himself is his notion of God, just as his notion of God is his notion of himself. The two are identical. What is God to man? That is man's own spirit, man's own soul. What is man's spirit, soul, and heart? That is his God. God is the manifestation of man's inner nature, his expressed self. Religion is the solemn unveiling of man's hidden treasures, the avowal of his innermost thoughts, the open confession of the secrets of his love. And so, and from here on out, Feuerbach and his followers were denouncing the perversions invented by fanatical priests, as Hegel warned they would. And so and Feuerbach's account, the thing about Feuerbach's account is that it's purely negative. It basically says, throw off the shackles of religion, worship the altar of the self, and you'll be good. Perhaps this would require murdering a few priests, but that's not going to change. It's not totally radical. But what and so Marx saw this and he says that, oh, this thesis is ahistorical. That's what the young Marx says. And he says, the young Marx says, does not the religious sentiment itself uh, is not the religious sentiment itself a social product, and the abstract individual whom Feuerbach analyzes belong to a particular form of society? And so the critique moves up the ladder from the relationship between individual and church and to the relationship between individual and society as mediated by the church. And so now we have this idea of we have this idea of Marxist idea of alienation, where the worker becomes poorer the more wealth he produces, the more his production increases in power and size, the greater his alienation is. And so the laborer, the laborer, in order to break free of this, um, he has to gain consciousness of the fact that gain consciousness of his place in the economic in the economic machine of society. And you know the and this is sort of the Marxist view of alienation. Now, the funny thing about this is that on its face, this kind of view is kind of silly because on its face, this sort of thing could be achieved if the laborers are sat down and made to watch hours of film about how the production and distribution systems of about the production and distribution systems of a modern decentralized economy. If you just have them watch all the workers watch economics documentaries and show them that what they're producing is the same as what they're buying, that's going to solve alienation.
Right.
Like at least on the face of it. Um, now, older Marx still has this kind of it has something of this view in him. He said so Marx, the older Marx, he's no longer talking about metaphysics anymore, but anthropology. But um, uh, what he's talking about is how in older Marx he says that the highly abstract social relations of capitalism mystify the production process and blind people to the nature of society, and this gives rise to ideology, the false
Right.
consciousness, which is sort of another which is another variation of Feuerbach's earlier view that religion is the cause of all our problems. You just replace religion with ideology and make the cause of it capitalism instead of
Yep.
fanatical priests. Um, and so, the capitalism tricks humans into thinking that capitalism is natural and not the product of political forces that can be altered. But this is anthropology. But Marxist theory does when you but on its face, this seems kind of silly. Um, the questions that we raised about alienation rise to the surface in a different form. If man is told clearly the actual relations of his production through, say, like a documentary film that he's made to sit down and watch, will he instantly recognize them as unjust and rebel against the system? That's not. I mean, that's kind of
Yeah, evidently
ridiculous.
not.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a few value judgments embedded into this. Marx presents this as sort of a kind of mathematical formula, but there is there but it assumes certain value judgments such as the utility of this capitalist system and the prudence of revolutionary social change, etc. So you're not going so I think, and so you have these weird instances where Marxism seems on its face silly because the problems Marx talks about seem to be the kinds that could be solved if you took everybody and sat them in front of an economics documentary. Um, but
Right.
I think the reason why is, there's a part of Marx that is not as much talked about in mainstream discourse, but you pointed out, which is epiphenomenalism. Now, I've gone on for long enough. How about you explain what epiphenomenalism is and why
Oh yeah.
Marxism is an example of this?
So yeah, epiphenomenalism is properly a term in the philosophy of mind, referring to which is the philosophy of the cognitive theater or consciousness, what substance, if any, it has, what structure it has. Epiphenomenalism there picks out this theory that the real thing, there is a real structure of consciousness. It's your physical body, it's your brain usually, or maybe a little bit more than that if they're a embodied cognition person, but it's really just your brain or your body. And that consciousness emerges as a result of the chemical processes that happen within your brain, the electrochemical impulses that trigger in your brain. If you've ever heard of the idea of consciousness being kind of like the result of this complex system, that's the same thing. Although that's not strictly epiphenomenalism on account of the kind of vagary of that sentence I just said. But anyway, that is in the philosophy of mind epiphenomenalism, the idea that consciousness is an emergent property of the real things that correspond to it, which are our physical bodies. And by the way, I should probably say, for people who are not familiar with philosophy of mind, that may seem insanely obvious, but it is, and it is pretty common, but it's not it's far from unchallenged in philosophy of mind. So there's actually a surprising amount of diversity in what people think there. So anyway, that's pretty clear. as far as philosophy of mind goes, what does it mean for an economic theory, or sort of a Marxism is not really purely an economic theory; it's kind of a totalizing discipline. But what does
Yeah,
it
I
mean
mean,
for?
yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier, it's sort of an anthropology in a
Yeah, right.
way.
It's a very yeah. It kind of reaches at Adam Katz has this good blog post. I'm just thinking of now, where he talks about transdisciplines. I mean, that's what he calls them. And the if anyone wants to look it up, it's called the transdisciplinarity of the hypothesis, right? And it's comparing generative anthropology, which I advocate for, with Marxism, and saying, at the very least, these two things have in common. They're transdisciplines. So easy, like William said, those are basically anthropologies, or that's kind of the wrong way around. Anthropologies are basically transdisciplines on account of how far they reach. But anyway, that's just a nice little connection there. Continuing on with epiphenomenalism, it's the analogy here is the idea that you have complex social forms, um, that there's not really an explicit attempt in most of Marx to account for them or explain their relations or to provide a typology for them. The greater thrust of his work, although even this isn't done with much vigor, is saying that those social forces, those legal forces, I mean, in his words, the totality of the relations of production constitute the economic structure of society. The real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. So that's a very hearty sentence. This was translated from German sentence, but the language there is really clear. He says, on which arises the social and internal cognitive
Yeah,
and
I
human
can see the
features.
analogy. Yeah, I can see the analogy here. So just as an epiphenomenalist in philosophy of mind would say that it's pure that the physical chemical makeup of our brains and our bodies are all that are the real deal, and consciousness is just something that emerges from it. It's like an emergent property of the
Mhm.
brain. Um, the and is not the real thing, but something that I just sort of. I mean, the emerges is the best word for it, I think. So too does the superstructure emerge from the base. So too does these cultural things emerge from the economic relations within society. Is that
Yeah, yeah,
it's sort of
exactly.
yeah, yeah. And do you think that Marx would have been like? Do you think that Marx would have been an epiphenomenalist on a individual level? Out of curiosity.
Oh, in a philosophy of mind sense, yeah. I mean, I don't think he would be a hardcore physicalist. I think epiphenomenalism kind of um, is almost what people believe, just left to their own devices, even though that's not really a thing. But it's just kind of common always. I mean, one of the things I'll end up referring to maybe a little bit later here is the Platonic dialogue Phaedo, which I kind of recently, I guess the word is studied. I mean, the way that I was sort of engaging with it, and not really read. It's not like because dialogues can kind of be read casually, almost like fiction. But yeah, that actually handles epiphenomenalism in good detail. And one of the guys who's the first level dialoguing people says, "Well, yeah, that idea, just talking about epiphenomenalism, is pretty clear to me. That makes sense. It's sort of what I always believe, just spelled out." People who are my fellow Greek language appreciators will actually enjoy the fact epiphenomenon means like something that appears on top of or out of something else. Epi is on top of, and painomenon means a thing that appears. And that is like almost the exact language he uses for like the real foundation on which arises yada yada. So it is like down to the modern terminology we use, the same general pattern, the same general picture of, or the same general ontology is, I guess, the right term for these two things.
So tell
So,
us, for me, why do you think that epiphenomenalism is wrong in a philosophy of mind sense? And can the arguments against epiphenomenalism in philosophy of mind be used against Marxism when Marxism and its sort of dichotomy between the base and the superstructure?
I mean, I'm a Christian, so obviously, I mean, there are Protestants who attempt to obviate this, but that doesn't work. I obviously believe in the soul, a real soul, not a formal or conceptual thing like a physicalist or eliminativist might believe in. So I'm pretty, rock solid on that. But what I'm not rock solid on is the specific critiques of epiphenomenalism. There's most of them are really critiques of physicalism and epiphenomenalism in its ossified or reified state, as philosophers will individually spell it out in modern analytic academic philosophy. There's actually a good amount of diversity there. So anyway, I don't have an extremely strong response to epiphenomenalism in an analytic context, but there are three good critiques provided in Phaedo that will appeal more to people who are handling this. I mean, because there's not a common analytic rendering of Marx. That would be pretty silly. But yeah, in Phaedo, the person who proposes epiphenomenalism does get three responses that I think are good responses. I just don't think they're what you'd maybe call logically consequent with respect to one another in the Abelard sense of the term consequent. But yeah, there's three general arguments. There's the argument I'd call from opposition, which is I'm just going to call it the emergent thing. Obviously, in this dialogue, these people are talking about the soul and the body and yada yada. But the argument from opposition is that the emergent thing, soul or social structures, social/cognitive structures, it often opposes the thing that it emerges from. Every time you engage self-control, a good way to describe what's going on is that the soul wants one thing and the body wants another thing. So they're in conflict, and good self-control is when the soul wins out. Now, this corresponds kind of in a very odd, right. So a large thrust of proper academic epiphenomenalism is showing, which they try to do this by empirical scientific means, which is pretty goofy. But they'll try to show that there's no such event as a soul interfering with the body, and therefore there's no contrast. There's never this opposition between the emergent thing and the base that it emerges from. But a lot of that is implausible. If you want a good reply to it, there's a book called, what is it called? It's by one of the guys who's at Essentia, the Essentia Foundation. Essentia. It's not coming to my mind right now, but it might later. Anyway, if you just go around their website, you'll see what book I'm talking about. It is explicitly marketed as a response to epiphenomenalism. But this argument of opposition, despite being, I'm not certain, but maybe dead in terms of philosophy of mind, is certainly reasonable for. In fact, I think I say one of these critiques or a critique of this genus in one of my videos, basically saying, hey, this king of France, all of the major economic forces are supporting slavery, right? But he, for very parochial, non-economic, power-thirsty reasons, goes through these kind of political reforms. He illegalizes slavery, which makes all of the people who properly own the means of production at that time very, very upset. So in a narrow sense, it's obviously not true that there's primacy for the fundamental thing. So we've already gotten to a point where the theory is super degraded if you're admitting that primacy, being the foremost thing, can't be accounted to the base on which the other things emerge. Then what emergence means is pretty lenited at that point, and that's what the argument from opposition in Phaedo is trying to get at.
That's a pretty. That's a pretty good argument again. Um, I think I think that it's difficult to use that opposition argument with regards to the the kind of mind body problem, because I don't think that you can make it. I don't think the case for, because that sort of assumes something like Cartesian dualism, where you have where
Mm,
the body is a substance and the mind is a separate substance that is united to the body, like a motor is to a vehicle, in the
right.
words of Saint Thomas. And he says, and the sort of the logical endpoint of that is is just to say that, when I'm talking to you, I'm not actually talking to you. I am piloting my body, which is not me, and using it
Right.
to communicate to you through communicate to your body, which you are piloting, and through which you see the. You know what? It's
Yeah,
this kind of ridiculous thing that hylomorphism, where the soul is the form of the body,
yeah,
does not uh, does not have a problem with that, because there's not really a mystery. It's, and also that view also gets rid of the mystery of how can the soul and the mind interact. And I think, in a lot of ways, the kind of base super perhaps the base superstructure view of society could be ameliorated that
oh
way.
right, yeah,
But
yeah.
with but that's just my speculation. Now,
No,
if
that
you
makes
want,
sense to me because a lot of the competing but similar economic theories to Marxism, like neo-Marxism, post-Marxism, post-Keynesianism, and stuff, they are a lot more like, basically, for people who don't know what William is describing with the soul. Um, the more sensible alternative he's getting at is called holomorphism, and something like that. If you're using it analogically for the kind of epiphenomenalism that Marx is exploiting, then I mean, that is a good way to describe a lot of the immediately competing intelligent frameworks, competing with Marxism as an economic theory.
yeah, well, I think one thing though with Marxism that I think is eh, okay. Well, how should I put it? Well, I think one thing about epiphenomenal. Let me first refute epiphenomenalism as best I can. You see, the idea behind epiphenomenalism is that there are these properties of the consciousness that and this consciousness emerges from the physical state, the kind of base physico-chemical state. Now, consciousness has several qualities that this physico-chemical state does not have. For example, consciousness, consciousness has intentionality. Consciousness has qualia. There is a sense of what it is to be to have this experience, and you can't really put this in sort of the third person terms. Things like pain. How can you reduce? It's difficult to see
Right, right.
on a materialist view how you can reduce something like pain to um, into something that's devoid of qualia, and intentionality. That's it seems. And so, and this is where you get into certain naturalist philosophers try to use something called property dualism, which is where you say that um, property dualism is a form of dualism that says that, unlike substance dualism, it says that there's only one substance that's material, but material things can have immaterial properties. So what they would say is, the brain that your brain, the kind of an example of this would be John Searle, who is an analytic philosopher. He proposes something called biological naturalism, which is, his view is that mental states are not identical to the firing of neurons or any other brain processes, but are nevertheless caused by such processes in a manner analogous to the way that the solidity of an ice cube is caused by the state of the water molecules composing it. And so this is sort of this emergence theory, where you don't deny the reality of the epiphenomena, but you still, while still maintaining that it's ultimately caused by the base. The problem with that half-hearted measure, in turn, is that you're basically saying that properties can exist without there being properties can exist without a substance to adhere them to, because here's the thing, right? Ice cubes, the water molecules, uh, ice cubes have properties that water molecules by themselves do not have. Like ice cubes, and the kinds of things that, for example, they're solid to touch. A water molecule by itself is not solid to touch. Now, a reductionist would say that, well, if maybe one water molecule is not solid to touch, but if you put them all together, then as a group they become solid to touch. But that's just that you're basically saying that there's a property that the properties are just magically appearing at that point. Yeah, and that's sort of what happens with the epiphenomenalists. They're basically saying that, we know that this thing is that we know that this these properties, these immaterial properties exist, but there's not really anything immaterial that they belong to. And
that's actually, that reminds me of the other argument in Phaedo. Actually, it's pretty similar. The other good one, because there's three, but only two of them are really quality. That gets made is how do I phrase it? The analogy that they're using for emergence in that specific dialogue is harmony, but I'll just say emergence. When one thing emerges from another, like with the hardness of an ice cube, it can be more or less so that thing, right? So a single ice molecule, like you say, not hard to the touch. Two is also not hard to the touch. Two molecules you would break apart the way that you sort of displace water by pushing your finger through them, or into them. And you could continue that for a while, and it wouldn't just uniformly be, it would go from like colloidal to sort of having the properties of a liquid at one point almost, to eventually being a full-on solid the way we recognize stuff. But those phase shifts, those aren't in the molecule. So that property that they're describing, the solidity of that ice cube, is, and I'm gonna have to head out in not too long, so I'm gonna finish this up quick unless you talk to. That property kind of changes and becomes more intense as the emergence changes, as the base, you could say, grows greater or grows more consistent. And it's true for harmony as well. A harmony is something that emerges out of several singers, and they can be singing in more or less harmony. The same way, you could have liquid water molecules suspended in a solid ice cube, and it would have the property of a little bit of a liquid and a little bit of a solid, depending on how striate it is. But the soul, they argue in this, does not have that. There is no being more ensouled or more soul-ish, because your neurons fire in the special way. And equivalently for Marxism, I guess, the application would be that, like, the material conditions don't produce more or less, I guess you could say, because he doesn't enumerate specific things corresponding to the social forms he's talking about. But there's not more or less English common law when there's more or less of the things that he proposes lead to it. There's not more or less of,
Christianity.
I mean, yeah, sure. Christianity kind of transcends all these different, religion in general, all these different economic shifts, which I do think are real, like the shift from feudalism to capitalism. So yeah, that's another issue, is that the supposed consequences don't grow more or less extreme as it's totally random. The way that Christianity or religion in general, or common law or yada yada, correspond to the material productive faculties or real power, like NGOs. It's just like totally random by any comparison you would care to make to the what he calls fundamental material relations that produce, in his mind, those social elements.
Interesting. Yeah, I think this line of thought would need to be better developed in your video, and I think I perhaps later on I could recommend that you read some of the works of philosophy of mind that I've read in the past. But
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, so is there how long can you remain on here?
Until 6:15 would work well.
Okay, so 7 more minutes. Is there anything else you want to say about Marx before you go? I'll probably stay on for a bit longer to talk about my opinions on Marxism.
Right, yeah. I mean, we should probably do a stream some other time, also talking about some of the things here, maybe more parochially things that we haven't covered here. But yeah, I mean, great talking about it. The epiphenomenalism argument kind of reaches everywhere, and it reaches into GA, which is the other system, the one that I prefer, because specifically GA does not make certain mistakes I think Marxism does, while allowing itself to economically fill the role that Marxism does, accepting the things that you and I, agree are positive in that discipline. But that is basically all I have to say about Marxism with respect to epiphenomenalism. That's pithy, that's sharp. So yeah, I mean that's my thoughts here.
Yeah, what I would say about the kind of what I would probably have to say about Marxism and epiphenomenalism is that the kinds of gosh, I can't believe I forgot what I was going to say. Oh man, I hate it when that happens. But I think I guess I guess what I was trying I guess what I'm trying to say here is that I remember now. So earlier I was talking about some of the problems with Marxism, like the kind of there's this kind of silliness where like I said earlier, if it seems like Marxism is based on the idea that the worker is unconscious because of the mystification of the capitalist system is causing through ideology, and if the worker was aware, then he'd either lose his alienation in the case of younger Marx, or he'd join the proletariat revolution in the case of older Marx. And I think this kind of epiphenomenalism is really the cause of this, because if you are a materialist, if you are an epiphenomenalist, then only material conditions can really change people's minds.
Right.
Only the change in material conditions changes people's minds. So of course, if the material conditions change, then people's minds will change in the way you predict.
Right, yeah. And that'll be the most significant thing to people because, in some sense, it's what everything that is significant to them comes from. So, which, I mean, is another thing that we don't have time to go down, but there's far more exceptions than incidents that follow that rule. So
Oh, definitely. Anyway, I guess I can talk to you. I'll talk to you later, man.
sure.
Um, I'm going to continue saying a couple of things about Marxism. Maybe we'll talk about them the next time we have a live stream on this topic. But
Yeah, definitely.
I just want to get my thoughts out there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's great talking. It's always great, spitballing stuff and hearing what you have to say and hearing your recommendations. I mean, this wasn't on the stream, but William has recommended me some quality reading with regard to Marxism, and still sifting through some of that. But always great talking about that kind of thing. And take care, because I'm going to be heading out pretty soon.
All right, all right. Take care, man.
All right. Have a good one.
All right. So, um, one last. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of some of the things that I do not like about Marxism, besides what we've talked about so far, which is its materialism, and it's actually, in fact, a consequence of the Marxist materialism, and the kind of and some of the things that I do like about Marxism as a kind of philosophy. So one of the main things about Marxism that we talked about so far is the idea of ideology. Basically, the economic system creates a kind of smokescreen that mystifies it to the in the eyes of the worker and causes the workers to be blind to the reality of their circumstances. You know, so a worker in a capitalist society will think that because of the nature of capitalism, um, the worker in the capitalist society will think that capitalism is natural, when in fact it's a product of political forces. Now, the problem with this is that you can really take this too far, and it actually, on some level, it could undermine the entire epistemology of Marxism. And one of my favorite philosophers, Edward Feser, talks about this in the context of what he calls the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is there are and the hermeneutics of suspicion include people like Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, of course. But there are others who are could be considered these kinds of masters of suspicion. So, what's the problem with hermeneutics of suspicion? Well, the thing is, human beings have to start when it comes to human beings discovering what truth is, they have to start somewhere, and a lot of the time they have to start from tradition. They have to start from what they've inherited from some authority or another, parents, church, scholars, government, or whomever. Such authorities might not always have the last word, but they cannot fail to have the first word. And to reject the mindless view that authority as such is always to be questioned is not to embrace the equally mindless view that authority is always to be trusted. But because there's this sensible middle ground that says that authority is unavoidable and has a necessary place in our lives, even if it's sometimes fallible. Now, uh, the thing is, I mean, so far we're good, but the but the thing is that there are certain modern philosophers, and overall there's this general tendency since the dawn of the Enlightenment to be anti-authority in terms of uh, where you get your knowledge. You know, the idea of Kant saying think for yourself, dare to know, or something like that. The idea is that we have to defy authority and dare to know dare to know things despite what our authorities tell us, because authorities can never be trusted, obviously. And Nietzsche and Marx are two of the biggest um, proponents of this view. For Nietzsche, all for Marx, sorry, for Nietzsche, all of our moral, legal, religious, and cultural beliefs, practices, and institutions are really expressions of the will to power. And so, as such, they have to be regarded with distrust and suspicion, and have to be treated as if they have no objective validity. And similarly with Marx, it's the same with Marx, only instead of just replace will to power with the interests of the dominant economic class. And so it's because of this sort of hermeneutics of suspicion, um, it undermines the epistemology of these things. Um, if we eh, if we take it to be because one of the problems is that okay, if we were to apply this consistently, then Nietzsche's philosophy and Marxism itself would both be subject to the same thing. So, I mean, what are for example, there are people like, Curtis Yarvin is one of the latest people in modern times, but also there is this great philosopher named Nicolas Gomez de Villa, also known as Don Calacho, who makes an appearance as one of the figures in my introduction sequence to my edited videos. He talks about how Marxism Marxism is sort of a ideology of the of the bourgeoisie, and the way he puts it is Marxists define the bourgeoisie in economic terms in order to hide from us the fact that they belong to it. And it's very clear that Marxism is sort of this bourgeois ideology. I mean, if you look at where it comes from, who has historically practiced it, who practices it now. I mean, there's this whole trope about the champagne socialists, for Pete's sake. So it's a that's a the whole champagne socialist trope is a cliche at this point, because of these types of people. And yeah, and so what ends up happening is, by the standards of Marxist epistemology, we have to disregard what the Marxists themselves are saying. But Marxism says that only Marxism can reveal the truth, so we've just destroyed ourselves. And Nietzsche similarly shoots himself in the foot with this. Now, the only way you can avoid this problem is by making these kinds of statements a lot less interesting, by saying that just by saying that people often promote certain ideas out of self-interest. Well, that's true, but that doesn't by themselves prove that the ideas that are being promoted out of self-interest are wrong. Um, so this kind of view, more to the point, one of the major flaws in this worldview is that it leads to this kind of paranoid ideology, where you think that the enemy, which in the case of Marxism is capitalism, is is permeating every aspect of life, and such that everyday moral assumptions are mere ideologies. Religion is a mere opiate to reconcile the oppressed to that power and so on. And Marxist theory is this kind of gnosis that reveals the dark and hidden truth about the world. And it's up to Marx, Engels, Lenin, and company to play the role of the Gnostic sages. They are the modern. They are sort of the 19th century Marcion, Mani, and Valentinus. And so it's this kind, and this is a view that was pointed out by Eric Voegelin. There are a lot of different modern ideologies that fit this mold. For example, wokeism, the the kind of intersectional view of reality perpetuated by Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi. They have this sort of paranoia Gnostic worldview. Now that said, I'm going to close out with some of the things I do like about Marxism and some of the things that I think have some validity. First off, it's very plausible that Marxism is Aristotelian in its view of nature in a lot of ways. The difference between Aristotle and Marx, of course, was that Marxism is more, it reduces everything to economics, and thus it sees human flourishing as being a purely economic thing. But both Marx and Aristotle believed that the good life consists in the actualization of one's powers. Now, Marxism would deny that there is any kind of morality inherent to it, yet Marxism says at the same time that capitalism is bad for humanity and oppresses us. And what I think is the cause of that is Marx is sort of using this non-moral idea of goodness, where capitalism is bad for humanity the same way that ripping the bark off of a tree is bad for the tree, and that it interferes with the flourishing of us, our flourishing given our nature. And there's this sort of and so there is this sort of essentialism inherent to us, and there's also a certain teleology inherent to the material world too. So his idea that material systems reliably exhibit tendencies towards certain outcomes. For example, when he's explaining certain social relations, he's saying that certain kinds of social relations exist within an economic system in order to allow it to make efficient use of its productive powers, or that moral and religious ideas prevail in a society in order to uphold the basic economic superstructure. And so it's very easy to see how Marxism and Aristotelianism, though they differ very, very much in a lot of ways, they both have this there's some overlap in their view of nature and how things operate in nature. Now, one thing about Marxism that is pretty interesting is the idea of commodity fetishism that's in Marx, especially in young Marx. Now, this is something that there was this conservative philosopher who died recently named Roger Scruton who talked about this in a book of his. So, in Marxism and in according to Roger Scruton, there's this kind of distinction between the consumption of property and the possession of property, whereas the former involves treating property as a mere means, the latter involves treating it as an end in itself. So, for example, if you have a possession, that's something you take care of, like an heirloom, a work of art, a rosary, a piece of land or a home. And so, because you possess that, you have the desire to pass it on to as a heritage, as a kind of heritage for your children. Um, this this is in contrast to the kind of property that is consumed for the sake of something else, and usually only temporarily. For example, pencils and paper clips, food, and money itself, and so on. Now, both consumption and possession are innocent in themselves, but the essence and legitimacy of property as an institution, Roger Scruton argues, is to be found primarily in possession. We cannot flourish as the embodied creatures we are without the stable extension of ourselves constituted by home and other possessions. The Marxist attack on property presupposes a conception of property primarily in terms of consumption. Property thought of essentially as commodity, but property as mere commodity is not property as such, but rather a corrupt or degenerate form of the institution of property. However, Marxism is correct in saying that under capitalism, property tends to be conceived primarily in terms of consumption or commodity rather than in terms of possession. And we can see this in how because of individualism and consumerism, a lot of these modern societies tend to treat everything as a commodity. Think of the way people sell their brand, talk of their brand, selling themselves, how they redescribe prostitution as sex work, talk about homes as something to flip for profit rather than to possess and pass on, of starter marriages, and in this general sort of rootlessness that inheres in modern liberalism, in this kind of, and everything tends, and this is some of the key ideas that reactionaries can take on board when they talk about modern economics. They can talk about how consumerism turns everything into an object for consumption and excludes nothing from the market. Everything becomes indistinguishable, disposable, replaceable, and this is only increased by mass production. The very idea of intrinsic value dissolves into money. So, um, yeah, this is something that we ought to be against. This process is because this process is happening before our very eyes, and I think we as reactionaries and conservatives or whatever you call yourself, we have to oppose this process somehow, or find a way to sort of exit this system that is causing everything to just lose its intrinsic value. All right. So I think I've talked a bit about that, and if anybody has any questions, please ask away. I'll be on here for a couple more minutes. I am trying right now. Personally, I'm trying to make this reply to another YouTuber named White Tom on uh, the idea of non. I'm still halfway done with that response essay. You can read my first response essay on my blog, or on my blog, on the Applied Virtue blog on Substack. I'm working on the next one that's a reply to Capturing Non's essay. In any case, I do want to ask Zach Cynical if he's still on here. What about that Twitter article? I'm here for the Twitter article about you. What Twitter article are you? And were you talking about me or about Narmal? I'd like to know. I just would like to know if what Twitter article you guys are talking about. You know, just saying, just asking you. Hmm. At any rate, um, let me know, Zach, if you're there. Let me know in the comments if you could tell me what this Twitter article is. Maybe link to it. Maybe I could say something about it on my Telegram or in my blog. In any case, I'm glad to have talked to Normal, and I'm glad to get my thoughts out there. So catch you later, guys. Till the next time.